what if I told you that Adam wasn't the first human to walk this earth? That before the Garden of Eden was ever planted, before the breath of life filled Adam's lungs, another race of beings already moved beneath the ancient heavens. Tonight, we journey into one of Scripture's most profound silences, a mystery hidden between the very first verses of Genesis. A truth so disturbing that it was buried beneath covenant and sealed away from memory itself. This is the story of the forgotten race, the beings who walked before Adam, the bloodline that God chose to veil from history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know this opening well, but what follows has been misunderstood for millennia. Genesis chapter 1 speaks of mankind, male and female, created in God's image. Yet Adam doesn't appear until Genesis chapter 2. This isn't repetition, this is replacement. Between these chapters lies a chasm deeper than most dare to see. A cosmic breath, a divine pause, and in that silence, an entire race vanishes from the sacred record. Not through judgment, not through curse, but through something far more unsettling, divine forgetting. Who were these beings of Genesis 1? They bore no names, held no covenant, breathed no purpose from heaven's throne. They were made, but never chosen, formed but never sealed. They walked the earth without command, without Eden, without exile, and that alone made them unacceptable. Listen carefully to the Hebrew text. In Genesis 1 verse 26, God declares, "Let us make man in our image." The word used here is Adam, not a name, but a title. Mankind. These beings were fashioned in divine likeness, alongside the stars and beasts, part of creation's grand tapestry. But in Genesis 2, everything changes. No longer does God speak humanity into existence. Now he forms with his hands, breathes into nostrils, plants a garden eastward in Eden. This is not continuation, this is a second shaping, deliberate, divergent. The Adam of Genesis 2 carries breath that the others never received, not just life, but remembrance. Eden was not the origin of mankind, it was the origin of memory. And those who came before were erased not because they failed, but because they remembered too much. Scripture tells us God saw everything he had made in Genesis 1, and behold, it was very good. Then silence. No genealogy for these first beings. No breath, no names. No mention of Eden, of law, of covenant. They vanish not with violence, but with omission. Why does the narrative not account for them? Because their existence was not meant to remain. They were a first draft, not flawed, but unfitted for the covenant that was to come. The early Jewish mystics noticed this divide. In their writings, they whispered of generations before Adam, of worlds before this world. The ancient book of Jubilees speaks of men before the garden. The book of Enoch hints at watchers and beings who walked the earth but bore no testimony. Even in Job we find a haunting reference when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, yet Adam is nowhere to be found. They were there. The veil simply no longer allows us to see them. These weren't myths or symbols. They were fractured memories of a truth too disruptive for covenant, that humanity was not shaped once, but twice. The Mesopotamian tablets tell of humans born before divine breath was given, builders, farmers, kings who lived, ruled, then vanished, not with flood or fire, but with silence. What if these weren't legends at all, but echoes of the same biblical truth? Throughout Scripture, their shadow lingers like morning mist. When Cain murdered Abel and cried, "Whoever finds me will kill me," who did he fear? Adam's children had barely begun. The text doesn't explain because explanation would unravel everything. The Nephilim appear without ancestry. Mighty men of old, men of renown from ancient days. No father listed, no tribe, only the echo of a beginning before the beginning. These are fractures in the narrative, shadows of a bloodline not born of Adam. Even in the promised land, giants emerge. The Anakim, tall as cedars, their spearheads like weavers' beams. Entire nations appear without genealogy, prompting God to command their complete destruction, not for their wickedness, but for their origin, for being something that didn't belong within covenant's bounds. This wasn't about moral failure. This was about narrative purity. The story had been rewritten around Adam, and anything older, anything that survived the first shaping, was now a threat to divine order. You see, Adam was not made because the others failed. He was made because they remembered. The first race bore no law, but they bore the trace of the hands that shaped them. In that memory they carried too much resemblance to God. And memory without covenant becomes dangerous. When God formed Adam from dust, it wasn't new material, it was the same earth. But this time he breathed, this time he commanded, this time he sealed the act with boundary and purpose. Adam was not humanity's first form, he was its first containment. The difference between the forgotten race and Adam lies not in the dust, but in destiny. They were made in image, but without instruction. Adam was made in image and then given law. That law tied him to heaven and to history. Without it, memory becomes a threat. This is why Adam's genealogy matters. It's the framework of heaven's covenant. Each name is a seal, each generation a continuation of divine order. The first race had no such structure. They multiplied without being counted, moved without being recorded, existence without accountability. But here's what haunts the sacred text: God didn't destroy them, He veiled them. That alone proves they mattered. In Scripture, what is irrelevant is erased completely, but what is hidden is protected. Like the tree of life guarded by flame, like the name above all names spoken only in smoke. Even after the great flood, these traces resurface. Giants reappear in Canaan. Ancient peoples emerge without connection to Noah's lineage. The prophet Amos speaks of Amorites tall as cedars. Isaiah mourns, "A people not called by my name." They were never cursed, never named, never held the law or broke it. Yet their very existence had to be hidden, because their memory contradicted the story heaven chose to tell. Not evil, not fallen, just too early, too free, too close to a truth that covenant couldn't contain. In Scripture, silence is not forgetfulness, it is intentional, it holds what cannot be named. Between Genesis 1 and 2 lies such a prison, not for sinners, but for the unchosen, those who bore image without inheritance, memory without memorial. The space between the verses is where they wait, not gone, only veiled. When God hides a people with no name, their absence speaks louder than presence. Shadows only stretch from something real. What we read as Genesis is not the whole story. It's the approved version, the thread chosen to carry covenant. But there were other lives unraveled, other stories untold. The silence between chapters wasn't empty. It was full of forgotten creation. Adam was not the first breath drawn from dust, only the first breath God chose to remember. From that memory came covenant, exile, redemption. But what came before him still waits beneath the soil of forgotten lands and ancient fears. They were shaped but never called, alive yet never recorded. And Scripture's silence is not erasure, it is containment. For what God veiled, he did not destroy, and what he buried still trembles in the darkness between verses. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember this. The earth beneath your feet has known other footsteps. Other voices have whispered to the wind. Other hearts have beaten with the rhythm of forgotten songs. The story of humanity began long before Eden. And perhaps, in the deepest places of our souls, we still carry the echo of that first, unnamed shaping. What does it mean that we are not the first? What does it mean that memory itself can be too dangerous for heaven? These are the questions that linger in the sacred silence, waiting for those brave enough to listen. The mystery continues. The veil remains, but for those who seek, the traces are there, hidden in the shadows between Scripture's most holy words.